Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our workshop for small specialists and new providers. This is part of the support that we're offering to providers on 2020 to 21 access and participation plans. We have hosted some targeted workshops on certain sections of the plans, and we're hosting a series of webinars to repeat the content covered at each of the workshops to allow for broader access for any of the providers or additional members of staff that weren't able to attend. So these webinars were originally scheduled for the week commencing the 29th of April, but in response to feedback at the briefing events on APPs, we've moved the webinars forward. So this is the first of the series, and we also are running sessions on evaluation, targets, and the assessment of performance. That they're all taking place next week. So the way this is going to work is we have a series of presenters who will run through some slides for you, and then we'll have a session at the end of each of those slots where you can ask questions of the presenters. So what you'll need to do there is go to the Ask a Question tab and type your question in, and then we'll be sorting through those and answering those that we're able to answer at the end of each session. This will also be recorded, so you can revisit the webinar at any time. They'll be going up on our website. So just to talk you through the objectives of today's session, this is to help providers to make your first submission of your plan credible and ambitious. So we'll be highlighting some of the key changes in our guidance and some of the areas that will require some additional support. We'll be focusing on some of the common queries raised by small specialists and new providers, and how you might be able to address those queries. And we'll be allowing time for you to put any questions to us so that we can have a sort of open discussion and provide as much support as possible. So just to provide a little context on access and participation plans. So the Higher Education Regulation Act 2017 set out a number of general duties. So these form part of our regulatory framework, and the one that we'll be focusing on, which provides the context for access and participation plans, is E, which is about promoting equality of opportunity in connection with access to and participation in HE. So moving on to access and participation plans. Here's the part of the Act that refers to access and participation plans. But essentially, we are here to identify good practice relating to the promotion of equality of opportunity and give advice about such practice to registered higher education providers. And we'll also be approving plans which your governing body can apply to the OFS for at any time. But the Director for Fair Access and Participation is responsible for overseeing the performance of the OFS's access and participation functions, performing any of those functions, and reporting to other members of the OFS on the performance of the access and participation functions. So our regulatory framework enables the Director of Fair Access and Participation to develop a bold new approach to supporting social mobility and equality and diversity through higher education. So our guidance says that we'll be radical and ambitious to make sure we deliver on the promise of higher education as an engine for social mobility and a gateway to a better life for those who undertake it. So essentially in our guidance this year, we have raised the bar and raised our challenge to the sector. And as a response to this, we've also increased the level of support. So in terms of the documentation, the engagement with providers and the various events and telephone surgeries that we're holding. This just sets out which providers would need an approved access and participation plan. So any providers in an approved fee category of the OFS register and those that wish to charge above the basic fee. So if you're not charging above the basic fee, there's every chance that you won't be needing to produce an access and participation plan. So you're welcome to continue listening, but you may not need a plan, so worth checking that out. Okay, so what should access and participation plans look like? So the key thing that we're looking for in this year's plans is the overarching theory of change, which should be based on a robust assessment of performance and articulated through strategic aims, objectives, and targets. We need to see strategic measures and investment that supports those strategic measures, and all of this needs to be underpinned by evidence and a credible evaluation strategy. Assessment of performance. This is what your access and participation plan should be based on. So we'd like to see you determine your aims, objectives, targets, and measures, all based on where your gaps are the largest, and for which groups at which stage of the student life cycle. So to look at your assessment of performance, we'd like to see you using the OFS data set, which my colleague here is going to talk you through later on. Where the data set doesn't give you all of the information you need, we'd like to see you considering other national and local data and research, and if possible, to use all of that. So your strategic aims and objectives is where you'll set out which of those gaps you intend to focus on for which groups. They should reflect the OFS key performance measures where appropriate, which are those set out in our Regulatory Notice 1. They must set out the changes that you aim to achieve and the timescales within which you aim to achieve those. And they should be measurable and relate to the target groups and stages of the life cycle that you're hoping to focus at. So targets, which we've also got the section on later on, should be ambitious, clearly defined, outcomes-based, as opposed to activity or input-based, and they should link directly to your strategic aims and objectives. They should be informed by your assessment of performance and take account of the key performance measures that I've just referred to. Your strategic measures is how you are going to meet your ambition and how you're going to work towards those targets and milestones that you've set out. So this would include areas such as your strategic approach across your whole institution, your student consultation, how you will monitor your progress made, what your evaluation strategy looks like, which we've also got my colleague Rich Shiner is going to be talking to you about evaluation later on as well, and the investment that your provider will be putting into each of the areas and your overall investment. So there are a number of ways in which we are supporting the sector with this work, and one of them is through the Evidence and Impact Exchange. Another way is around supporting collaborations such as the National Collaborative Outreach Programme and Outreach Hubs. We have included a number of effective practice tools online this year. So we have an A to Z reference tool online, and we're also funding a number of challenge bids around student success and the local graduate challenge bid. We have run a series of briefings, which are policy briefings, which have set out the changing context and requirements. As I referred to earlier, the workshops for specific areas of the guidance and impact reports. Okay, so just moving on to some of the common queries that we have both through the OFS offer and HEFKey have been hearing from providers such as yourselves in terms of our guidance past and present. I thought it would be helpful to set some of those out. Okay, so we often hear that for small and some of the newer providers that data is an issue. So small numbers, meaning that it's difficult to do a full assessment of performance, a lack of live data. And we also hear that in smaller institutions, there is not the capacity or the expertise available that there are in larger institutions to deliver some of this work. What we often hear is that access is a particular issue, often stemming right down to grassroots issues such as certain specialist subjects not being covered in the national curriculum. So for arts institutions, agricultural colleges, these can require years of extracurricular intensive training which are not covered in the state sector. So we do get questions about how providers can deal with this and how that feeds into kind of long-term planning versus 5-year targets and milestones. Student support can be a particular issue. So the specialist nature of some provision can be a barrier for certain types of students, particularly provision for physically disabled students on certain courses and in certain institutions. We also hear that in some types of institutions, particularly arts-based institutions, that there is an oversubscription for learning disabilities and the disproportionate effects that can have on providing support for those students. We have been hearing, which is a misconception, particularly this year, around rigid expectations of spend being more relevant for larger institutions. Obviously, this year, that is not our primary focus, and our focus is more on outcomes as opposed to the money that providers are putting into certain activities. Student engagement, we hear, can be an issue in particularly smaller institutions in terms of engaging on the development of the plan itself, being at a particularly busy time of year for students. And for smaller institutions, that there are no student unions in some cases or formal networks, which can make that engagement a little bit more tricky. Okay, so with regards to targets, small numbers can prove a difficulty when it comes to setting targets due to fluctuations and actually presenting data due to anonymity issues. Collaborative targets, we do hear from providers that these can be difficult for especially small and specialist providers where they may be competing for a small pool of potential students. School curriculum changes, which may lead to, again, fluctuations, problems with more long-term targets and milestones. And then with regards to progression targets, that employability coding can make it can cause difficulties in terms of reporting back against progress into employment. So attainment raising, again, this is something that we've been speaking to providers over the last few years, in that academic entry requirements, obviously that can be difficult for specialist providers to actually support. Teaching expertise might be in specific areas, and outreach with schools, we also hear, can be problematic due to schools not wanting to perhaps engage with smaller or more specialist providers. Okay, so financial support. We are aware that many specialist providers particularly provide large financial support packages because they believe that it assists retention and success. There are the reasons cited for this are around the expensive equipment sometimes required and long hours of intensive study preventing part-time working. This is fine, provided that you are able to show evidence that this is actually helping with your retention and student success. Again, we've touched on this, but collaboration can be more difficult due to a competitive environment and in some cases geography, where providers may be set further away from other similar types of providers. Again, what I would say there is that there is no impetus to collaborate with providers that have the same sort of provision as yourselves. so to think about collaborating more widely with different types of providers. Okay, so I've just set out some of the conversations that we've been having with smaller specialists over the years. We will try and touch on some of those issues as we go through the various presentations. We may not be able to answer all of those, and you may have different sets of issues that you might want to raise with us, and that's absolutely fine. So please put them in your questions as we go, and we'll try our best to answer them at the end of each session. So I'm going to hand you over to my colleague, Matt, who is from our data foresight and analysis team, who is going to talk you through the use of our data set, which should help you with your assessment of performance. I would just flag here that for some smaller providers, and you will have already had probably a play with the data set, which you will have been sent the access to in an email, some of the data may be suppressed for you. Where that is the case, as I've already referred to, we would expect you to use additional tools such as local internal data, national research. The data set won't be able to provide you with all the data that you need, but Matt's going to explain how it works and how you can use it to its full potential. Where you do have data, as I say, any queries, then you can come send them through, and Matt will try and answer them at the end of this session.
Okay, so I'm going to talk you through some of the data resources we have made available to support providers in their production of their access and participation plans. We've prepared a short video that will tell you where to find the data resources and how to use them, which we'll play for you now.
Hello. This brief video will give you an overview of the Access and Participation Data Dashboard that was published by the Office for Students in March 2019. This will be a high-level overview explaining how to access, use and explore the dashboard and the data contained within it. The dashboard was constructed using data about UK undergraduate students returned from higher education providers in England through the relevant HESA or ILR data returns. It also includes information from the Destination of Leavers from Higher Education or DELI survey, which surveys students about their activities 6 months after graduating from their studies. The latest 5 years of data is included. Students are attributed to the provider where they are registered. Note that this may not be always be the same provider as where they are taught. International and EU students are not included in the data, and we have published data broken down by those providers that are registered with the Office for Students at the time of publication. We will periodically update the underlying data to include additional providers as more become registered with the Office for Students. We also include data aggregated for the whole sector. This data contains all English higher education providers, whether or not they are registered with the Office for Students. To access the data dashboard, navigate to the Office for Students website at officeforstudents.org.uk. At the banner at the top of the page, click on the Data Analysis section. You can then scroll down the page to the Get the Data section, where you'll find a link to the Access and Participation Data Dashboard. Before we get into the dashboard itself, you can find out more using the links on the right-hand side. Clicking through to this section, you will find information about the dashboard and what it contains. Of particular relevance to this video are the links to documentation about the dashboard. In the user guide, you will find information about how to use the dashboard and the accompanying data files that are available from the Office for Students. The methodology and rebuild instructions have further detail on how the data resources were constructed. This includes details on statistical tests, the rounding and suppression that have been applied, as well as information to allow providers to rebuild the data from individualized student data. There are other useful resources on this page, including links to download the underlying data, an FAQ section, and a link, further information on how to contact us if you'd like to know more. We can navigate back to the dashboard using the link on the right-hand side. The dashboard itself is displayed in the section at the bottom of this page. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to use an equivalent version of the dashboard that contains data for a fictitious provider. To get the best experience, we can maximize the dashboard using the full screen icon at the bottom of the page. Tabs across the top of the page allow us to navigate to different charts. The Key Measures tab highlights data from those areas that the Office for Students has identified as strategically important at a sector level. The remaining tabs show data across the student life cycle stages. Access, those students that get into higher education. Continuation, the proportions of students that subsequently continue their studies in higher education rather than dropping out. Attainment, the proportions of students that gain first or upper second class degrees. And progression, the proportions of students that go into highly skilled employment or higher level study after qualifying. I will start exploring the data in the Continuation tab. When we load this tab, we can see that there are 4 yellow boxes across the top that can be used to explore the different aspects of the data. The first shows rates, in this case the continuation rates for different groups of students. We can also explore the gaps between those rates for different student groups, the ratio between these rates for different student groups, and we also have a summary of areas that have been identified as having statistically significant differences between groups and their peers. Let's explore continuation rates a bit further. At the top of the page, we can select a provider that we are interested in from the filter. When we select a new provider, we can see that the charts at the left-hand side of the page will update reflecting our selection. We can also select different levels of study from all undergraduates, first degree, other undergraduates, or undergraduate with postgraduate components. We can use the other filters on the page to look at continuation rates for different student groups. The initial selection here shows continuation rates for 21 to 25-year-olds. We can look at data for different age categories, deprivation quintiles in terms of the English IMD measure, disability in terms of whether students are disabled or not, disability type, which includes a further breakdown of disability types, students' eligibility for free school meals at Key Stage 4, some intersectional measures, participation in higher education in terms of the Polar 4 measure, and by student sex. Focusing now on the charts below the initial data selections, we can see continuation rates for 21 to 25-year-olds at the selected provider. Full-time continuation rates are at the top of the page. Part-time rates can be found at the bottom of the page. On the left-hand side, we have continuation rates for the selected provider, and on the right-hand side, we have equivalent rates aggregated for the whole sector. The charts show a blue line and 2 grey lines. The blue line shows the continuation rate for the selected student group across the 5-year time series. Note that the numbers in the dashboard are not exact and can be rounded to various degrees. If we hover over each data point, we can see more information for that year, including, in this case, numerator and denominator. The continuation rate is calculated by dividing the numerator, the number of students who continue their studies, by the denominator, the total number of students in the selected group, expressed as a percentage. The grey lines represent the degree of uncertainty associated with the continuation rate by an upper and lower confidence limit. Typically, where small numbers of students are involved, confidence limits will be wider. This reflects the sensitivity of the data of the continuation rate to changes in outcome for a small number of students, in this case whether they continue in higher education or not. Tight confidence limits indicate that we can be more confident that the underlying rate has not been affected by randomness and chance. In some cases, there may be one or more points in the time series that have been suppressed. You will see this as missing data points, which may result in discontinuous lines, isolated points, or even no lines shown at all if all of the data has been suppressed. Typically, this happens when small numbers of students are involved. Further detail on the suppression that we have applied can be found in the methodology and rebuild document that is available on our website. We can move on to look at gaps in continuation rate between different student groups. As was the case when looking at rates, we can select a provider of interest and explore the data. This time we can select a comparison between two groups within a characteristic. The initial selection compares continuation rates between 21 to 25-year-olds and 26 to 30-year-olds. As before with the rates pages, we have charts below displayed for the selected provider on the left and the aggregated picture for the sector as a whole on the right. Gaps in continuation rates are displayed at the top of the screen for full-time students and at the bottom of the screen for part-time students. The charts express gaps in continuation rate for the selected comparison as a percentage point difference. This will always be the first group minus the second group. In this case, the continuation rate for 21 to 25-year-olds minus the rate for the 26 to 30-year-olds. So here, a positive gap will mean that the continuation rate for 21 to 25-year-olds is higher than the rate for 26 to 30-year-olds. If the gap were negative, it would mean in this case that the continuation rate for 26 to 30-year-olds is higher. As before, the charts show a blue line for the percentage point gap and grey lines for the associated confidence intervals. Additional information can be seen by hovering over these data points. In these charts, we also have information on whether the gap in continuation rates is statistically significant in each of the years across the 5-year time series. Where data is flagged as statistically significant, it is less likely to be the result of random chance and variation. But a statistically significant flag does not attach any value judgment on the data. It does not distinguish if the data shows any good or bad performance, nor does it convey the size of the difference that is shown and whether it is important or not. Conversely, where the data is not flagged as statistically significant, it does not mean that what the data shows is unimportant, only that we cannot be sure that what it shows is reliable. As well as statistical significance of the gaps in continuation rates for the selected comparison in each year, underneath each chart, we can see how the gap is changing across the years. We are shown the change in the gap between the first and last year in the time series, and the change in gap between the penultimate year and the last year. We are also shown whether this change in gap is statistically significant or not. Returning to the top of the page, we can look at ratios of continuation rates between different student groups. We can select comparisons of interest in the data as before. Ratios are similar to the gaps comparisons. They are another way of comparing outcomes for different student groups. Instead of subtracting rates, as was done for the gaps, here we express the ratio as the continuation rate for the first group divided by the rate for the second group. You may find where the absolute rates involved are smaller, the ratio comparison becomes more meaningful and may allow greater insight into the data. The final selection along the top of the page allows us to explore statistically significant differences. As was the case in other selections, we can select a provider of interest, and different aspects of the data. The tables shown below summarize all of the cases of statistical significance for the data that has been selected. The table at the top summarizes statistical significances for in-year gaps. Below this, we can see summaries for statistical significance of the change in gap across years. When selecting providers, the summary tables may be empty. This means that there are no statistically significant gaps or changes in gaps in any of the comparisons included in the dataset. This can happen where there are small numbers of students involved. That completes the walkthrough of the Continuation tab. The Attainment and Progression tabs have a very similar structure and content to the Continuation tab, so we will not go through these here. In these tabs, rather than looking at the continuation rates, gaps, ratios, and statistical significance for continuation, instead we can look at attainment or progression rates, gaps, ratios, and statistical significance. I will now move on to look at the Access tab. Here we can use the yellow boxes at the top to navigate between looking at comparisons in Access compared to the underlying population, the proportions of students with different attributes entering higher education, as well as a summary of statistically significant differences. Starting with comparisons to the population. As before, we can select a provider of interest and look at different aspects of the data in terms of level of study, either full-time or part-time, in terms of mode. The charts below will update depending on the filter selections that we choose. This section is slightly different to the other sections in the dashboard, as this data contains information for 18-year-olds only. We can explore data for students based on deprivation quintile, ethnicity, and polar 4 quintile in this section. The initial selection looks at deprivation 1 quintile 1 in terms of English IMD for all 18-year-old full-time undergraduates. The chart at the top left compares the proportion of these students that gain access to the selected provider to the underlying proportion in the population for 18-year-olds. For the deprivation characteristic, this compares to the English population. For the ethnicity and polar 4, this compares to the UK population. The gold line in the chart relates to the proportion for the selected student group at the provider. The blue line represents the proportion in the underlying population. In this case, the proportion of 18-year-old students from deprivation quintile 1 that can gain access to the selected provider is higher than the population of 18-year-olds across each of the years in the time series. Underneath this, the chart at the bottom left shows the gap in proportion of 18-year-olds in the population and 18-year-olds at the provider with the selected attribute. We have a blue line showing the percentage point gap and the associated confidence intervals. This is always the proportion in the population minus the proportion of the provider. So a positive gap means the proportion in the population is higher, and a negative gap means the proportion at the provider is higher. Next to this on the right, we have an equivalent chart showing the ratio rather than the difference. And both of these charts at the bottom relate to the proportions shown in the chart in the top left. The chart in the top right shows data for each attribute for the selected characteristic. In this case, we have information for each deprivation quintile at the provider. The chart gives the number of entrants at the provider for every 10,000 with the same attribute in the underlying population. So looking at the blue line, which shows data for deprivation quintile 1. This charts the number of 18-year-old students from deprivation quintile 1 at the provider for every 10,000 people that live in deprivation quintile 1 areas that are in the underlying population of 18-year-olds. If the proportion of 18-year-olds from each deprivation quintile match the proportion of 18-year-olds in the underlying population, then the lines in this chart would sit on top of each other. We can explore access proportions by selecting the yellow box at the top of the page. We can select a provider of interest and explore the data we are interested in. The charts below show the proportion of students within each characteristic at the provider. We are no longer restricted to just looking at 18-year-olds here. The initial selection allows us to explore the proportions of students in different age categories. The charts at the top of the page show data for full-time students, and at the bottom of the page we have equivalent charts for part-time students. The charts on the left-hand side show proportions within the provider, and the charts on the right-hand side show proportions for the sector as a whole. We can explore different characteristics using the filter. The final selection across the Access tab summarizes statistically significant differences at the provider compared to the underlying population. The table at the top allows us to quickly see where in-year gaps are statistically significant. The tables at the bottom show similar data for changes in gap across the time series. The final tab that I'll explain in this video is the Key Measures tab. This tab highlights data from across the student lifecycle that the Office for Students has identified as strategically important at a sector level. All of the data in this tab can be explored in more detail across the other tabs that we have looked at in this video. At the bottom of the page, you can find links to web pages where you can find more information about our key performance measures. The yellow boxes at the top allow the user to navigate sections highlighting access for students from underrepresented areas, gaps in continuation rates for students from underrepresented areas, gaps in degree outcomes between white and black students, and gaps in degree outcomes between disabled and non-disabled students. That concludes this video. For more information, please see the web pages mentioned at the beginning of this video. Thank you for watching.
Okay, so just going to address some questions that come in as a result of the video. So the initial question is, can we compare our performance with all HE and FE providers? This would be more useful than a comparison with all providers. So the short answer to that is, in the data tool, no, you can't do that. You can only compare to the whole sector. And the kind of reason for that is that we want you to look at your absolute performance and where you have gaps, rather than compare yourself to others or benchmark in any other way. And we have another question. If the provider has limited gaps in terms of both KPMs and statistically significant gaps for access, continuation, etc., what actions should we take? Whilst we may find gaps, these are not statistically significant due to limited numbers, etc. Do you really want us to look at such gaps which are not statistically significant, or confirm that we see a gap, but that is not statistically significant, and we will monitor but not take specific actions to close? So in terms of the statistical significance and gaps, what I would say is that first you should be looking at the gaps themselves and what you judge to be important in terms of your performance and the scale of gaps for particular groups. The statistical significance gives you a kind of indication that this is reliable in the data. It doesn't necessarily mean that every gap that you highlight has to be statistically significant, but it's worth bearing that in mind based on the kind of conclusions that you draw from that statistical significance or not. Okay, I'm going to move on now and cover a couple of slides. So first, addressing some small number issues. So having small numbers can affect the data that is available to you or that you can reference in your plan. So you might have no data available for particular groups or comparisons, and you might have few cases that are flagged as statistically significant. So it's important to state where small numbers have been a limiting factor for you and how you've sought to overcome this. So you might want to present your data slightly differently to the way we've chosen to do it in the dashboard and data resources. You could look at aggregates of data over 3 or 5 years, for example, or use larger groups of students that you're able to use those larger numbers. And you can also supplement your this data resource with alternate data sources. And you may have limited data capabilities within your provider. And if this is the case, we want you to state how and when you seek to improve your data capabilities in your plan. Okay, so some examples of other sources of evidence that you could use. So in terms of student data, you've got resources from HESA or ESFA, DFA, UCAS, for example. You may wish to use your own data that you have available to you. You can use your own analysis of individualized student data that you have to present the data in a different way than we have done so for you. You can use data from the Teaching Excellence Framework or other qualitative data you may have available, such as from surveys or focus groups, for example. And you can also look for kind of government and other local data sources, such as that from the Office for National Statistics, or use academic research that may be published and of relevance to you. And you may wish to use some other outputs of analysis, not a data source in itself, but you may be able to use the conclusions from that analysis to where it's relevant, as long as you can demonstrate that the analysis you've undertaken is robust and credible. Okay, I'm now going to hand you over to my colleague Richard Shiner, who's going to talk you through evaluation.
Right, hi everyone. Moving on to a session on evaluation. So I'm going to talk through the evaluation strategy and what our expectations are in terms of your A&P plan, and I'm going to spend most of the time on the evaluation self-assessment tool. I've got quite a lot of slides, so I may well skip over some of them just so that we make sure we get through it within the time. But before I move on to our expectations in the guidance, I want to talk through some of the key messages and some of the things that come up when we're talking about evaluation. So firstly, just to acknowledge that it is a challenging task. It is really hard, particularly challenging if you're a small provider with limited resources, or maybe a college where HE is not your primary business. And we are asking you to do more this year, but you do have time to build up that capacity and that capability. And it's very much about doing what you can do within your context. And we're aware of lots of the challenges around lacking time and resource, being able to access data, getting consent, or having the academic and specialist skills to undertake evaluation, and also persuading other people, often senior colleagues, of the value of evaluation, and the competing demands of delivering your activities while doing evaluation at the same time. So we do understand these, and that's why we're trying to provide additional resources to you, including the evaluation self-assessment tool and guidance, and why we're running these workshops and these webinars. So the second one is around that you'll never get a result or a finding from an evaluation that tells you for certain that something is working. It will only ever give you an indication, and that could be a strong or a weak one, and it is up to you to try and interrogate those claims, interrogate that evidence to understand the claims that you can make. There's no such thing as a perfect evaluation design or approach that will get you that perfect result. There's always likely to be a compromise you'll have to make, and for many of you that might be due to a small cohort size, or low response rates to a survey, or a lack of consent, etc. We do not value quantitative evidence above that of qualitative. They both have value in this space. You'll be pleased to hear probably that we're not requiring everyone, not driving everyone to try and run randomized controlled trials, and we do understand some of the concerns about them, but we do also think there's a time and a place for them if they're done in an appropriate environment by people who have the appropriate skills. And sometimes we hear concerns that it's unethical to provide a potentially life-changing intervention to some people and not others based on randomization only. But I would take the view that unless you have strong evidence that your intervention is effective, then it's unethical not to be evaluating it, and that could give you a license to run a trial. So we value appropriate evaluation design for the interventions and the research questions that they're trying to answer, and that's really important. An experimental design that can generate causal evidence is likely to produce the strongest indication that an intervention is working, and that could be using qualitative or quantitative evidence, but this is not common and often won't be practical in the social science world. Evaluation is not an option. It's an essential element of your program delivery. It's not a tick box exercise, and it isn't about you keeping an audit trail, because you can't be making claims that something you're doing is working unless you're evaluating it. And sometimes people will say that they know something works, but they haven't been able to generate the evidence to prove it yet. Although we can understand that viewpoint, and there may well be a good chance that what you're doing is working, but without the evidence, you can't be sure that it's a good use of your money. The most important thing, which I'll talk through in detail, is that you have a clear theory behind what you're doing, you understand the change you're looking to make, and you have evidence that a particular activity or intervention can affect that change. You know how to collect data to measure that change. Once you have that, you can start to build your evaluation design on top. So why is evaluation important? Well, there's over £1 billion being spent each year on access and participation activities. So we collectively have a moral imperative to try our best to understand the impact of that investment, particularly as it's funded by students and taxpayers, and has the aim to improve outcomes for students, to reduce inequality in higher education. And if you're not convinced by the moral argument, there is also a value for money argument, because more effective use of spend will enable you to be more efficient. And there's some really good examples of providers who are embracing evidence and evaluation to drive improvements in A&P. We want to see more of those, and we've seen really good progress over the last 4 or 5 years in this area, and we want to see more. So I'll just move on to what we're asking in the Access and Participation Plan guidance in relation to evaluation. So you need to demonstrate that you have a robust and credible evaluation strategy, and you need to demonstrate how you will improve your approach over time. You need to show how your evaluations influence your future practice and how your self-assessment has informed your strategy. And if you're investing particularly heavily in particular activities, we want to know how you will evaluate them. And then finally, how does evidence and evaluation inform program design? And these are just a few of the things that you may refer to or use as part of your developing your evaluation strategy, and this includes the evaluation self-assessment tool, which I'm going to come on to next. So we've commissioned the development of the self-assessment tool over the last year. Colleagues at University of Exeter produced it as part of a larger piece of research to support evaluation practice and to improve the quality of evidence being generated. It sets out 5 core dimensions: the strategic context in which evaluation is undertaken, how evaluation and evidence shape current program design, how evaluations are designed and how they are implemented, and then finally how learning from evidence and insight from evaluation shape future improvements. We're encouraging you to use and complete the self-assessment tool because we think it's a useful way to inform your strategy, because it helps you to identify areas for improvement. We also think it's a useful process to go through if you're an organisation that's trying to embed an evaluation culture. And it applies to all types of providers, and it's been tested in a number of different providers, including small specialist and FE colleges as well as larger providers. And completion of the tool works best when there's an involvement of people across your organisation, so not just one person, either an individual or just one person in a widening participation team. And overwhelming feedback from the pilot suggested that when a wide range of people were involved, it helped to improve understanding across the organisation and get buy-in from senior colleagues. And the aim of the tool is to assist you to understand whether your current approach goes far enough to generate high-quality evidence about the impact of your work. There's a scoring system within the self-assessment tool. It's very much for your own use so that you can set a baseline and then look to improve over time. It's not going to be used by us to scrutinise or benchmark providers, but what we might use it for is to try and identify areas where we need to give you additional support, which could be in the form of more guidance or more training. And you're not required to submit completed tools to us, but we would like it if you did, because then it will help us support you. We're not prescribing what your evaluation strategy looks like, because that's up to you and your context and the activities that you propose to implement. However, we are encouraging you to consider this 5-point framework to help you think about your current approach and where you might need to improve. I'm going to talk through each dimension of the tool now, but I'm going to focus more on the first 2, so strategic context and program design. So the first dimension is strategic context, and this dimension is concerned with the extent to which an evaluation culture is supported and prioritised within your organisation, and whether there are opportunities for staff to enhance their evaluation skills and understanding. And this slide includes a number of questions which are included within the tool. So what does good look like in terms of strategic context? Well, that this would look like evaluation is being prioritised at a senior level. There are resources committed to evaluation, and this might be a proportion of the budget, or it might be investing in expertise. It's important that senior managers understand how important evaluation is, and that it should be embedded into your A&P work. And you're more likely to be effective in this area if you're an organisation that's open to learning and encourages and creates opportunities for its staff to learn and develop their skills. In terms of what you might do within this context, you might ensure that there are opportunities to talk about evaluation, and particularly within strategic meetings, that evaluation is included as a regular item. Have a more joined up approach involving people across your organisation who have a wider range of skills and experience. And then, as discussed previously, ring fence a budget for evaluation to ensure that it does happen. So moving on to the next dimension, which is program design, and this dimension considers the rationale for programs and the extent to which program design and choice of outcome measures are underpinned by and informed by the existing evidence, and whether evaluation is built in at the design stage. program design is not strictly evaluation, but we wanted to include this element in the tool because it's an important part of the process and it underpins your evaluation approach. So again, I've included some of the questions within the tool that we ask you to answer. So in terms of what good looks like, it's really important that you have a reason for doing the things that you do and that you need to be able to articulate that. We want to avoid vague or unspecified aims and objectives. So what is the specific change that you're trying to make through your activities? And are you clear how your activity or your program of activities can support you to effect that change? And can you clearly describe this process? So in terms of what you might do, we think it's really helpful as a starting point to develop a logic chain that describes your investment and your activities and your planned outputs and your desired outcomes and impact. And then you may well choose to undertake a theory of change process to try and map your desired outcomes and challenge some of your assumptions. And it's important to test the evidence that you're drawing on to shape your decisions. Is it rigorous? Is it trustworthy? And I think you need to be prepared that you might need to work differently, maybe have to change a course of action, or stop doing things that you've been doing for a number of years if you're not clear that they are working or that there's evidence to be doing them. And we've included an example of a fairly common theory of change to highlight the importance of this approach, because we think that they're an essential planning tool that can underpin your evaluation approach. And even if you don't call it a theory of change, it's really important to set out the change that you're trying to achieve. So in this case, your ultimate goal is the increased chances of your outreach participants entering higher education, and the changes that you'll see in the short to medium term, which you might describe as your interim outcome. So in this case, there's an increased motivation for schoolwork, which results in stronger GCSE attainment, and then the activities that you're planning to undertake to affect your desired change. And in this example, it's some form of raising aspirations for higher education activity. So as a starting point, that's incredibly useful, as it allows you to challenge some of the assumptions. So how do you know that your summer school or your open day will result in increased attainment or increased knowledge of higher education? What evidence is that based on? How can I measure if my activity is having an impact? And is there data available to measure that? So this example, which I've taken from Neil Harrison, who's currently at the University of Oxford, previously at University of the West of England. This is taken from his research, which looked at the evaluation of pre-16 outreach. And I think it really highlights the importance of challenging some of those assumptions and unpicking the evidence, because this is a fairly common theory of change or outcomes chain that you might see for pre-16 work, but when you unpack it, it starts to fall down. So the only link in the chain with reliable evidence is that improving GCSE attainment will increase chances of entering higher education, and that's been proven from Claire Crawford's work. But the other links are a lot less strong. So Neil Harrison's other research suggests that aspiration raising won't necessarily result in increased motivation for schoolwork, and Stephen Gorad's research casts doubt on the link between motivation and attainment. So this, what on the face of it looks like a fairly sensible process between an intervention and a desired outcome, actually doesn't stack up, and highlights the importance of doing this for your interventions. So in terms of evaluation design, this is the third dimension, and there's no hard and fast rule about which impact evaluation research design is most appropriate for different categories of A&P programs. But what the tool does is it prompts you to think about the extent to which evaluation of your programs is proportionate to the activity and appropriate for the purpose of measuring impact and the claims that you want to make. And we've recently published research from the University of Exeter, which sits alongside the self-assessment tool, and it separates evaluation into three different types. So narrative, empirical, and causal. Narrative is where a provider has a clear narrative for why it's chosen a particular activity, and has a clear strategy for what change it is trying to make. So a basic example might be that there's very strong evidence that a particular intervention works in a similar context, and therefore a provider chooses to implement it in their own context. And we are suggesting that this type would be expected as a minimum for all types of activities. Type 2, empirical, is a type of evaluation that collects data that shows people receiving an intervention have better outcomes than if they didn't receive the intervention, but it doesn't establish causal effect. So this could be something like a pre-post intervention change where you're testing people's opinions on something before and then after the intervention. And then finally, type 3 is causality, so where there's evidence of a causal effect. This could be qualitative or quantitative, and the evidence generated suggests that participants receiving the intervention show positive change relative to a control or a comparison group who didn't receive the intervention. So evaluation design in terms of what does good look like? Well, you will have reviewed the existing evidence before deciding what interventions you're going to choose and how you're going to evaluate. You've selected an evaluation type that's appropriate to your intervention and the claims that you want to make. You've identified intermediate goals as well as your final outcome. You're triangulating your evidence, so not just relying on a particular evidence, but looking at multiple types. And you've identified appropriate skills and expertise to undertake the evaluation. Some of the things that you might do is to ensure that evaluation is built in from the start, that you've embedded particular methods and processes for collecting data. You've thought about how you build evaluation into your planning activities. So if you have a standardized approach to project management, could you ensure that evaluation is considered as part of that, and that you have a formal evaluation plan in place, and you've identified who's going to undertake the evaluation. In terms of evaluation implementation, which is the fourth dimension, so this involves thinking about the measures and tools that you use along with other factors such as reliability of the data, collection mechanisms, and access to appropriate resources. And again, here's a series of questions that we've included in the tool. I'm going to, due to time, I'm not going to go through these ones in great detail, but we have included a slide on what good looks like. And then finally onto learning. So this part is designed to help you think about how evaluation findings and results are used to inform practice through reflection, sharing, and dissemination. And again, here's a set of questions included in the tool, and a final slide on what good looks like. So we've had one question asking whether you could complete the tool multiple times, for example, with different groups, which absolutely you can. We have designed the tool so it could be used to cover all of your programs, and it's split up into access, student success, and progression. So you can complete the tool once if you wish to, but a number of providers have fed back that they've used it multiple times, either for different groups of students or for different stages of the life cycle, and found it really helpful to do that. So I think that's entirely up to you and what works best for you.
Okay, hi everybody. You'll notice on your slides that it says Elizabeth Garnham. I'm not Elizabeth Garnham. Unfortunately, Elizabeth isn't well, so I'm sort of deputising for her. I head up our work on access and participation regulation, so I'm going to be taking you through what we say about ambition and targets. So we've set out quite clearly what our expectations are in the guidance that we produced at the end of February, both in the Regulatory Notice 1 and in the Good Practice guidance that went along with it, the Regulatory Advice Note 6. And those expectations do apply to all providers, but they do have to be set within the context of providers. And we do recognise that, particularly for small specialists, you have quite particular context to consider when thinking about your level of ambition and your target. But as I say, in terms of the quality and the level of ambition, those expectations do apply across all providers. One of the key factors, I think, for small specialists particularly is around resourcing. So you might be in a position whereby your assessment of performance has identified a number of gaps, but your size means that you simply might not have the capacity to address everything all at once in the same plan. So what we would advise there is that targets that you set need to be meaningful in your context. You should definitely focus on those areas and those students for which you have the largest gaps, and you need to explain to us in your plan why you've set the targets that you have and why you are focusing in those particular areas. Where resources are a serious constraint, you could think about how you might work with other providers. I mean, we do appreciate issues around competition, but where you have other providers facing similar issues, similar gaps, there could be real advantages and economies of scale in terms of collaboration. Also think about how actually being smaller can work to your advantage in terms of being able to implement a more strategic and inclusive approach. This can sometimes be easier to achieve in smaller environments than the much larger faculty type institutions. In terms of ambition, you'll see that the OFS itself has set key performance measures in this space for the sector, which I think does provide quite a clear sense of our own level of ambition and gives a clear sort of indicator to providers in terms of the level of ambition we might expect to see in your own plans. Now, like us, you might set your objectives, which you expect to achieve over a much longer time frame. So for our key performance measures, we've set a 20-year time frame, for example. But then you would need to set out in your plan targets about what you expect to achieve over the 5 years of the plan, and to think about the sort of trajectory that you need to be on, you need to see to meet those overall objectives by the time frame that you have actually set out. So when it comes to developing targets, they need to be situated within an evidence-based theory of change. And you can certainly think about short, medium and longer term outcomes. Now, we're using illustrative examples here, and I must say that we have simplified them enormously just in order to sort of illustrate what we mean. So we're going to be looking at sort of a raising attainment type targets. And you can see here that the ultimate aim is to increase access to higher education, but this will necessarily be a long-term aim of the intervention that you're putting in place. So you need to think about what the key milestones and the sort of short and medium-term outcomes would be, by which you'd be able to see if you're actually on track to deliver on that ultimate longer-term outcome. You can see that in the short term, you might seek to measure changes in students themselves, such as improved metacognition, greater levels of engagement, etc. You might also be looking over the medium term to think about how you might review how you make your own admissions decisions to take greater account of the context of prior attainment more effectively in the way in which you admit your students. And then, of course, you've got the longer-term outcomes around access to higher education. And then you need to think about, how you're evidencing what you're doing and the approach that you're taking. So, as I say, these are just for illustrative purposes only, and these are kind of showing you what your targets might look like, how you might go about constructing them. So you need to do your own work there to establish your evidence-based theory of change. And you need to set out what you really want to achieve and then kind of work back from there. Now, you'll see on the top line, this is the example that Rich has just provided to you, where you can see that you have links between certain elements that may or may not be quite strong. And as Rich has already identified, the link between raising aspiration work and increased motivation for schoolwork, through the evidence we have, isn't particularly strong, and nor is the link between that and then stronger GCSE attainment. However, there's a link between strong GCSE attainment and increased chances of entering higher education is very strong. So you really need to look at that in some detail and think about the evidence you've got underpinning the approaches that you're taking. So once your evidence-based theory of change is established and clearly set out in your plan, any of the outcomes shown on the screen may be a result of the raising attainment target. And the outcome chosen will very much depend on your context and the duration of the initiative versus the duration of the plan itself. So some raising attainment targets may be more credible than others, dependent on the provider's context. So providers who choose to have high entry tariffs will have more ambitious, longer-term strategic approach to working with schools with greater sort of coverage, if you like, long-term sustained work when addressing longer-term issues such as access to music provision. So we know that that's got a long time frame attached to it. And then providers working with more mature students might sort of look at including comprehensive access provision designed to raise attainment to levels required for HE study and over. So we have set some of the questions that you probably need to be thinking about as you're looking at your levels of ambitions and your targets. And I think as you start to develop your plans, needing to think about what gaps and life cycle stages you do need to be considering. If you do have those grassroots problems, such as that we know that we can see in the performing arts, particularly, and in music performance, how can you affect change over the 5 years of the plan? And then what are your longer-term objectives going to be in those spaces? And to really think about what opportunities there may be for you to collaborate with providers like yourselves around the various issues and challenges that you may face. So I think that's going to be all from me, and I'm going to hand you back over now to Rachel.
Hi there. So that's all we wanted to cover in terms of content. We'll allow just a few minutes for any more questions to come in relation to Sarah's presentation or any of the other presentations. We have had a couple of sort of provider-specific queries come in, which we will follow up after the webinar. But yeah, we'll just allow a couple of minutes for that. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. So we've got a number of questions. The first one is, if we have positive gaps showing that we outperform the sector, should we identify these or only look at negative gaps? Basically, we're expecting you to do a kind of comprehensive assessment of performance, and this will show all your gaps, either negative or positive. I think there are two different issues here, though, around positive gaps and outperforming the sector. We really want you to be thinking about your own performance and not necessarily benchmarking yourselves against the sector, because if all of the sector are doing quite badly, that's not really something that we want you to be benchmarking against. So taking that to one side, in terms of gaps, we clearly want you to focus on where you have the negative gaps for the target groups that you are looking at. Your assessment of performance will show all gaps, and you should just say, our performance in this space is very good, and so we're not going to be focusing on that area, and that's fine. So we've got another question here, which is, any interventions designed to improve GCSE results at the college may contribute to increasing participation in certain groups, but the majority of our students go to mainstream universities. So we may be doing great work which has a significant impact, which does not reflect in our own metrics. Can we evidence improved access of our students to other providers? Yes, you just need to provide the evidence to us that the measures that you are taking, A, are related to improving access to higher education and have some engagement with that, and then you are able to evidence the results of it. So where you're looking at such explicit attainment-raising activity, which is set to improve access to higher education, that is something that you can certainly include, but you do need to provide the evidence around it in terms of improving access to higher education. We have a large proportion of students in a collaborative partnership elsewhere. Where trends differ, are you only interested in the overall trend, or should we split our targets? We've got a little bit of a discussion about what is meant by this. Not quite sure whether what we're talking about here are students that are registered with this provider who's raised the question but are studying elsewhere, or whether this is something about you have collaborative activity that's a joint activity. So in the first circumstances, I think that we are, of course, interested in the main in what's happening with your students as an overall provider. But if you are seeing things in your assessment of performance where there are particular issues with a particular aspect of your provision, you might want to be highlighting that, bringing that out and deciding if there's something specific that you need to do around that. Again, this is all about having a very thorough and comprehensive assessment of performance and really understanding your student groups and your student bodies wherever they may be studying. If this is part of a more collaborative arrangement where you have you're working with other providers to deliver something in a more joined up fashion, then again you might want to separate that out and you might want to treat that a little bit differently. But again, if these students are registered with you, we would expect them absolutely to be included in your assessment. Okay, we've got another one. Collaborative relationships take a long time to set up, for example, with the LEP, council, or with the local MATs. Are you expecting these to be set up before submitting the plan, or are you expecting us to describe a route to setting them up? In terms of collaborative relationships, I think this is where it's going to be useful for you. Our expectations around collaboration are not set in stone in that respect. I think where you can see that there are going to be real benefits to collaboration and where you can see that actually it's going to be helpful in you addressing the issues around your own performance to set up these collaborative partnerships, then I think you need to be talking about that in your plan. I don't think we have an expectation that they all come ready-made, but if you've identified that actually working collaboratively with these other organisations is going to be of a particular help in particular circumstances, then yes, in your plans, just tell us what you intend to do about it. Okay, so we are in a transition between franchise student numbers and directly funded students. In the next 1 to 2 years, all of our HE students will be directly funded. Would it be appropriate to consider our entire historic HE cohorts in the assessment of performance? Regardless of whether students have historically registered with us or our HEI partner, we have generally taken the same approach to access and participation with some minor separation around things such as financial bursaries. For us, it would seem more appropriate to look at all of our HE students in assessing our performance. I agree, it would make absolutely more sense for you to look at your historic patterns, and it's going to make for a much more meaningful assessment of performance. Again, I think you just need to explain the context and explain what is going to be happening so that we're fully aware that you are moving from subcontracting to having directly funded numbers, and so those students will then be registered with you. But I think it makes sense, but you do need to tell us, because actually where students are registered with a different institution, we do expect that institution to also include them in their own assessment of performance, because they do have responsibility for the provision for those students. So it's important that you tell us, that you explain the context, but that you're doing this because you are moving into that directly funded model, and so it makes sense for us to see what's happened historically to the student groups that you have. Okay, to what extent is the expectation that providers use data from the OFS data set for the whole period of the data? For example, our institution changed validating partner in 2014-15, and since then our curriculum offer has developed and continues to develop. Would it be more sensible to look at data, therefore, from the past 4 years rather than the whole 8 years' worth of data that's been provided? I think that from our perspective, again, the assessment of performance it has to be undertaken in the context of what you are doing and what you're providing. If you're not making full use of the data set that's been provided to you, again, just explain why and why it makes sense for you to focus in the way that you have. If it then comes in and we do have some queries, we might come back to you with those, but just it has to make sense for you and it has to be meaningful. What we want is an assessment of performance that is going to be meaningful and gives a really good picture of where you are and where you need to be. So as I say, when you're thinking about things like this, and this is more broadly when you're looking at issues around data, does it make sense? Is it going to be meaningful? And if you're not using things that we might expect you to use, just tell us why and explain why.
Thank you, Sarah. So that is we have one more question coming in, I believe. Okay, so there is a question around, is there any further support interpreting the data on the dashboard? Where are the FAQs located, which were referenced in the recent APP seminar? Okay, so on our website, on the Access and Participation pages, under Access and Participation Plans, there is a whole host of links. There's the A to Z effective practice, and there's some FAQs under there. That's where you'll find the FAQs. In terms of somebody's also asked about further support, which I think I've just covered. The slides will be emailed out to the individuals who registered for today's webinar. The webinar will be going online, and we are also hosting some telephone surgeries. The dates are on our website now, so you can book the telephone surgeries through our website. But they are not, they are a good way to actually book in a slot. And if you have a number of colleagues who wanted to speak to a policy advisor here in one go, that would be a good opportunity. But you are always able to drop an email through to APP queries, and a policy colleague will be able to get in touch and answer any provider-specific queries that you have. So I think that's it from us. Just to say thanks for joining us. And do use all of the resources that we've put on our website in terms of supporting you to help you get your plan to be as credible and robust as it can be for the first submission. Thanks very much for your time. Bye.